A warning. This podcast contains descriptions of sexual and family violence and self-harm, which some listeners may find disturbing. You can contact Lifeline on 13 11 14 or the domestic violence hotline 1800 RESPECT.
Subscribers to Shadow of Doubt get to hear episodes first and get access to all our bonus material. Subscribe at theaustralian.com.au or check out our channel on Apple Podcasts, Crime X Plus. Episodes 2 and 3 are available to binge right now.
Dear Mum, I hope that you are okay and that you are looking after yourself and not just everyone else. I see that you understand my situation at the moment, but I need you to respect my decision of having some time away from you and the family. Honestly, I don't need to explain why. I gather you know why. But what I need to explain to you is how much I do love you. Mum, you are an amazing woman, full of so much courage and strength.
Emily Johnson wrote that letter from the psychiatric ward of her local hospital, not long after she was admitted for depression and suicidal thoughts at the age of 17. Troubled as she was, Emily took time to express love and admiration for her mother Susan, as she had done throughout her childhood, in cards and letters to the woman she once described as the best mum anyone could wish for. Yet the following year, Emily would sit down with police and tell a shockingly different story. She would describe her mother as a predatory paedophile who had abused and betrayed her, in league with a sadistic father who kept her as a sex slave for 13 years. In court, she would denounce her parents and describe a childhood of such extraordinary depravity that her father is now serving the longest jail term for child abuse in Australian history, 48 years. The mother she once idolised is serving a 16-year sentence. How that dramatic turnaround happened is a story that unfolded inside the psychiatric hospital where Emily spent much of the final 2 years of her teens, and where she would attempt to kill herself many times. It's a story detailed in her medical records and remembered vividly by hospital staff, who even at the time had serious misgivings about the treatment she was receiving.
I mean, she was being called depressed for quite a long time, wasn't she? And so they had to go through all of the bloody antidepressants. And then the antipsychotics. Place was sort of divided about it, you know, all the doctors and the nurses. But we didn't talk about it except at these extreme case discussions. But of course, always what came out of them was trying a different pill. Just ridiculous.
A lot of us seniors were wondering what was going on, and we were told she'd use and play therapy and some kind of memory recall therapy. The intricacies of those therapies, we weren't allowed to know about that. It seemed to be kept secret from us, kept away.
I'm Richard Guilliatt, and this is Shadow of Doubt, Episode 2, Digging Deep. Only a month before her hospital admission, Emily Johnson had been at the height of her achievements as a sportswoman, competing overseas for the first time. But she had returned from that trip disturbed, telling police that she'd been raped by a sports trainer who had snuck into her hotel room. Her boyfriend at the time, who we'll call Sam, says Emily appeared to have no specific recollection of the assault when she first came home. But then they had sex and her memory was triggered, which is exactly what Emily had told her friend Tara, as we heard at the end of the last episode.
And I was like, what's going on? And yeah, then she said that, I think this has happened. And she said I just, sort of blanked for a bit, just like I just shut down and it was coming back to her. But yeah, that was sort of in the first 2 or 3 days after she got back.
So the way she phrased it was that she she thought this had happened to her.
Yeah. And then it became more clear once she put it together.
Sam says Emily also told him how uncomfortable her father's sports massagers felt, that he went too far. But in Sam's mind, it was the alleged rape that was the source of her distress and her rapid deterioration. Within weeks of being hospitalised, she became so acutely suicidal that she fled the psychiatric ward and climbed up a bridge in town. It was the first of many escapes. Her sister Rebecca witnessed this catastrophic decline on her early visits to the hospital.
It was just like your sister was just disappearing. She was so drugged out. There was no emotion, there was no nothing. Just suicide-wise, like the scars just started coming.
At that time, Rebecca still believed her sister's story of the hotel room sexual assault. Police were investigating, and Emily's parents were planning to sue the sporting organisation involved. But her mother Susan remembers being perplexed that her daughter was getting drastically worse, rather than better, inside the psychiatric ward.
Every time she tried to have an attempt on her life or she tried to harm herself, they would call me because I was the person, responsible, duty of care, and that's all they'd say to me. She's had an attempt on her life, and I would obviously be so distressed and say, why, what's happened, why isn't she getting better? And they would say, we can't tell you that. So that I became incredibly frustrated because it just seemed to be getting worse and worse as the weeks went on.
The adolescent ward was a small unit in a new mental health facility that had been opened with some ceremony. What the Johnsons didn't know is that it had a terrible reputation, even among its own staff.
It was always a toxic workplace. I do mean that term toxic. It was people just complaining all the time how much they hated the job.
That's a former psychiatric nurse who we'll call Michael. He quit the profession after working for several years in the hospital where Emily was treated. The story Michael tells is one I heard from more than half a dozen nurses who once worked there. They say hospital management had casualised the nursing staff to save money, sparking an exodus of experienced nurses and creating a stressful and dangerous workplace. Some staff were self-medicating to deal with the stress. Others had turned to the teachings of the esoteric healing guru Serge Ben-Hayan. That included one of the nurses involved with Emily's care, who told colleagues that psychiatric patients can be possessed by malign spirits and different personalities. Michael remembers the adolescent ward as a place where patient management was particularly lax.
I did a couple of shifts over there, and wow, that was it for me. I'd never worked in child and adolescent, so I don't know if other units were the same, but there's a term they use as to describe nurses with their interactions with patients. They say, look, you can be over-involved. Now, the nurses I were working with on this couple of shifts are extremely emotional. They seemed as though they were dramatising things. It just did not seem healthy. The standard view that nurses had about child and adolescents is, quote unquote, they reward bad behaviour.
It's an account backed up by Michael's former colleague, Catherine, who worked in the hospital for nearly a decade and left with post-traumatic stress.
They've always had difficulty too in child and adolescent, mainly, quite frankly, because they don't have very good staff. They have staff who constantly sympathise with patients at times when they really need to be very professional and take the reins. But our clinic, you would have very green doctors at times who wouldn't seem to understand this sort of general kind of policy that's adopted in most psych units to really only keep these people for a couple of days, 2 to 3 days. They don't need to be actually in a unit for weeks on end, and sort of then trying to fill, their believed needs with, other things they're learning from other patients, which are, quite often, maladapted ways of living.
Emily was one of those patients, according to a doctor's report which noted that her self-harming mimicked another patient. In response, she was heavily sedated with 2 powerful antipsychotic drugs, along with an antidepressant and sleeping pills. Her normally strenuous exercise routine was drastically curtailed. And in a written self-assessment not long after she was admitted, she described feeling hopeless, alone, and without purpose. In her first escape, she sprinted into town and clambered up on the guardrail of a bridge before passers-by dragged her down. Afterwards, she told her psychiatrist that she felt an incredible high from the experience. Susan Johnson began to question her daughter's treatment.
She did tell me herself, the times I did go in there, that they told her that her life wasn't normal, that she needed to be allowed to, go out more, and that she should have been eating a lot more chocolate. I remember she had all this chocolate and she was putting on all this weight. And that's when she started exercising. They stopped that as well. I did bring up with them that I was very concerned that the wiring of her brain and her whole body and the way she responded and needed to eat and needed to exercise could be adding to the depression, and to suddenly stop and to do what they did to her, and then fill her up with antidepressants and antipsychotic drugs. To me, it could have only added, but no one listened.
What Emily's mother didn't know is that she and her husband Martin were already under suspicion because of false and misleading information about them which was circulating among the doctors. Emily had been receiving counselling at the local sexual assault centre since reporting the overseas rape, and her social worker Donna had taken a dark view of the family from the beginning. The counsellor was disturbed by Emily's disclosure that her father's sports massages had felt inappropriate in her early teens. And although Emily had said she didn't consider the massages to be sexual assault, Donna evidently disagreed. Her notes refer to the massages as abuse, and police had been notified that Emily had disclosed ongoing abuse by her father. Donna had also told doctors at the hospital that she believed Emily's father was trying to sabotage her sporting career, which seems odd given that Martin Johnson was Emily's coach and was heavily invested in her success. Emily's case file at the hospital was littered with misinformation about her family. Admission records stated that Emily had lived alone with her father in another state for the first 3 years of her teens, and that her mother Susan was often away interstate and overseas. But none of that was true. Emily had rarely been apart from her mother and had never lived alone with her father in her teens. One of Donna's colleagues at the sexual assault centre had accused Emily's parents of being reluctant to seek assistance for their daughter, when in fact the Johnsons had been consulting doctors and counsellors since Emily began having anxiety attacks as a 15-year-old. How so many errors became part of the official record is hard to know, because none of the counsellors or doctors involved in Emily's admission ever testified in court. But there's something even stranger about these records. At various points, they record conversations the Johnsons are said to have had with their daughter or her counsellor about the massage issue. Conversations which both parents insist never happened. One doctor, for instance, noted that Donna had spoken to Emily's father and he'd agreed to stop massaging his daughter. But Martin Johnson says that's simply not true.
I never had any phone calls and never spoke to the woman either on the phone or face-to-face at any time. I wouldn't even know what she looked like, or who, if I bumped into her in the street, it would be a stranger.
Other notes suggest that Emily told her counsellor she'd had lengthy conversations with her mother about her father's sports massages. But when I brought this up with Susan Johnson over the phone from prison, she was shocked and said it was the first time she'd heard of it.
She never brought it up with me at any stage. I don't think we ever discussed it. She never ever spoke to me about any massage or anything like that. She could never look me in the eye and tell me one single thing. I swear my life on that, because I would have acted on it. I was never told. There was maybe she was trying, that was the thing, and she just couldn't. That's the feeling I get now when I know what I know now.
Of course, the Johnsons are convicted paedophiles, serving long jail terms for the abuse of their daughter. You might wonder why we should believe anything they say. They could be lying, or they could be mistaken. Memory is selective, after all. And yet, logically, it seems unthinkable that Emily's counsellor would call up Martin Johnson, a man she suspected was an incestuous abuser, to discuss his daughter's confidential disclosures. And then there's Emily's letter to her mother, the one we quoted at the beginning, the letter in which she says she needs time away from the family and adds, "I gather you know why," as if they haven't discussed it directly. If that's true, if Emily believed her doctors had spoken to her parents about the massage issue, if Donna believed that Emily had spoken to the parents, and if the doctors thought Donna had spoken to the parents, then everyone had their wires crossed. What the Johnsons say is that no one spoke to them about what their daughter was actually disclosing, and their account is supported by Sam, the former boyfriend, who visited the hospital many times. He says Susan Johnson seemed as mystified as he was about what was going on in Emily's treatment, and that Emily herself insisted he not mention anything to her mother about the massage issue. In fact, Susan Johnson recalls she was so confused that she drove to the sexual assault centre unannounced one day to demand answers from Donna.
I think I just went there, and she did not seem happy to see me at all. She wasn't very welcoming or very supportive. It was like right from the start she had an intention to try and persuade me that there was some sort of something going on with my daughter's father that, I probably know about, but I don't really recognise. And that's when she handed me the tissues, and I think expecting me to sort of blurt out things. She may have said touching or something like that, but more he may have been acting in ways that weren't obvious to me. She said often mothers and other people in the family sort of are in denial about. That's what she used. She used the word denial. I said, why is my daughter cutting herself so much? Is she getting therapy about the overseas assault? That is why I brought her in. And she said, yes, that's probably happening, but, there's lots of things we don't know yet. It's going to take time. She needs time. And I said, so you find it acceptable? She's slashing her wrist, and she said, that's what they learn to do in there. It helps her to release the adrenaline. And that's when I said, we'll use the exercise to do that. And she just said, she just seemed to feel it was a normal practice. I'd never in my life heard anything like this or seen anything like this.
Susan's daughter Rebecca recalls a similar experience when she was called into the sexual assault centre and met the social worker who had earlier wrongly accused the family of being reluctant to seek help.
She said, so tell me a little about your childhood, tell me a little bit about, what your father's like, he coached you. Was your dad strict? Was your dad controlling? How did that make you feel? And then she kept telling me the words, dig deeper into this. She goes, it's there. Then she said to me, there's more, you need to tell me there's more. I just was getting angrier and angrier. Not angry, but more frustrated. Why is this happening? And I had no idea.
The social worker would later deny Rebecca's account and tell police she never asked such suggestive questions. Whatever the truth, It's easy to see how these early encounters set the tone for events that followed. To a counsellor who suspects incest, nothing is more familiar than angry disbelief from the family of the victim. Emily had denied that her father was abusing her, but often such disclosures emerge piecemeal. Her story about being raped by a masseur overseas was so confused that even some of those close to her doubted it. She told her friend Tara she hadn't even remembered the rape until after she returned home. And yet she was exhibiting all the signs of trauma. She was distressed, self-harming, and voicing suicidal thoughts. What's clear is that Martin Johnson quickly became a focus of her counselling. Emily would be asked questions about her father for months without disclosing any allegations of abuse. But her condition deteriorated so drastically that by her 6th week in hospital, she had attempted suicide twice and caused serious injuries to her arms and legs. Doctors responded by doubling her drug doses and having her involuntarily detained. 2 months after her admission, she escaped again and was found in a park, bleeding from the neck and wrists. In her counselling sessions, Emily began remembering uncomfortable moments with her father, such as taking coffee to him in bed when he was naked. She was experiencing nightmares about him, and her antipsychotic dose was doubled again. Emily was climbing the walls, one nurse wrote. In 1 week alone, she tried to escape 3 times. Susan Johnson recalls visiting her daughter and finding her stupefied by drugs, her arms scarred from lacerations.
She wasn't getting better, she was just getting worse and worse. But no one seemed to be able to explain to me why that was happening. One of my frustrations was that, or concerns that I raised, was that she was going over to a counselling session on Tuesdays. Like, they'd walk her across the road, and then that would be a counselling session that was like compulsory, and then she'd go back and have all this counselling with, her doctors. And the two didn't seem to meet at any point, and I didn't know what was being said at that time, but I was just worried about that they weren't working together.
One person who shared that concern was a veteran psychiatrist who worked in the hospital where Emily was being treated. In this podcast, we're going to call him Dr. Brian Williams.
I don't know whether I'm being unfashionable in this, but I think once you're in a psychiatric unit, the idea that you might have to go somewhere else to get your sexual assault counselling, frankly, I think it's absurd. I think it's absolutely absurd. You're never going to be able to get enough communication between the two systems for the whole situation to be being managed as well as it could be. They're two different services with a completely different orientation. It's quite unsatisfactory. And as a consultant psychiatrist, I never felt that the approach of sending people from a psych unit to a counselling service was appropriate.
Dr. Williams wasn't directly involved in Emily's treatment, but he remembers her case, the escape attempts, the constant self-harming, the chaos it created on the ward. He acknowledges how challenging a patient like Emily can be in a busy mental health hospital where staff are overworked and under-resourced. But when I showed him the hospital records tracking Emily's deterioration and the escalating drug doses, he shook his head.
It just means that they weren't able to control how upset she was. And, it just suggests to me that the situation was being mismanaged. That here's this highly trained athlete stuck in a psych unit. In the best of possible worlds, of course, there'd be somebody who'd go for a run with her every day, preferably her mother or somebody or other like that. But of course the unit's too scared to let her out of the unit for fear that something dreadful would happen. It's quite likely that it wouldn't have, particularly if it was the mother that she was running with. I'm merely pointing out that to idea that there's anything like best practice or whatever the hell that is going on here is just a nonsense, a complete nonsense. It's impossible that such a thing could be occurring under these circumstances.
When I asked Dr. Williams about the drug doses Emily was on, he didn't mince words.
So about a month after she's gone in, she's on up to 600 milligrams of Seroquel.
Yeah, look, this is just an abomination.
12 weeks after she was hospitalised, Emily stole a guard's security pass and sprinted out of the hospital. Her mother remembers getting the call.
They said to me that she had escaped, and they didn't know where she was. The security guards couldn't catch her, and they felt that because I was very fit and exercising a lot, they suggested that I go out and find her in the streets. I was pretty horrified at the way they said that. It's like they just gave up on her.
Susan phoned her daughter Rebecca, who jumped in her car and joined the search.
We went to all the spots we thought she might be. In particular, I went down to the river because I was horrified that I would find her dead in the river. So by the time we got to the afternoon, it was just before dark, I was really, really thinking we're going to find her dead. And then my daughter called me on the phone. She was very, very distressed, and she said she found her on a bridge.
Emily had run to the same bridge that she'd climbed 2 months earlier, but this time she'd lacerated her arms and thigh before clambering up on the safety rail. Rebecca reached the scene just as several pedestrians dragged her sister down.
Basically, I remember jumping out of the car straight across the road and ran across, grabbed her. We held her down with 3 security guards. She was bleeding from here to here, everywhere. And it was at that moment, some big bald guy said to me, "Can you please check her for weapons?" And I said, "Yeah, no problem." And it was there. There was one tucked in a little pocket. She was out of it. And it was in that moment she yelled, "Mum's going to hate me. This is all my fault. Mum's going to hate me." And she just kept saying it.
Susan Johnson arrived there to see Emily on the ground, struggling. And then she noticed that Dave, their police friend, who had been investigating her daughter's rape complaint, was on the scene in plain clothes. He seemed unusually calm, she recalls, and he assured her everything would be okay.
She was surrounded. She was still trying to get up and get back onto the bridge. She was bleeding everywhere. And her eyes were just, I've never seen that look in her eyes. She just had this look. It was like a psychosis sort of episode.
Emily's wounded arm required 14 stitches, and the incident marked a turning point for her doctors. They moved her into the hospital's high dependency ward, a far more austere environment, and recommended that she be transferred to a secure mental health unit in Sydney. There, she was told, she would be locked in for much of the time, and family visits would be limited. It was at this point that Emily underwent a dramatic change. She insisted she wanted to return home. Her mother recalls the transformation.
From that point, everything just changed. That was when she just decided, and she said, "I want to come home. I've had enough. I want to come home." It was like this turning point. Yeah, it was this incredible turning point.
The hospital records for this period are largely missing, but the shift is reflected in a letter that Emily sent to her mother around this time.
Dear Mum, I know things have been really hard the last few months. Mum, you know you mean a lot to me. I need you through this time. Things are going to get better. Well, they are a lot better. You are a wonderful mum, and right now, I need my mum. I look forward to spending time with you. I am missing exercising in here. I just want to do any sort of exercise. Everything is going to be okay, Mum, and I'm going to have a great life, and you will be a big part of that.
Martin Johnson says it was during this period that Emily requested he come into the hospital, only the second time he'd visited her. He recalls that day as a moment he believed his daughter was finally turning a corner.
Her improvement was so noticeable. Like, between my first and second visit to her, it was just like she was good on the first visit, but she was just back to normal in the second visit.
A young female psychiatrist had now taken over Emily's case. As with all the hospital staff, we can't use her real name, so we'll call her Dr. Marie Warner. Susan Johnson recalls that Emily was determined to get this new doctor's permission to return home.
She actually said to me, I will convince her. She would go in there, I think, for an hour nearly every day and talk to her, and she said, I will convince her. This is what I want. I want to come home. I cannot stay here. There was dailies and things like that before she actually came home. You know, that was when I was going in there a lot, bringing her organic food, you know, all the things that I'd provided her with before. You know, took her out for some exercise. She was still on very heavy medication, so her breathing was really loaded, but she really, really wanted to get out and exercise. It was like she was on a mission.
Emily went back to playing sport on her day leave, and she told her psychiatrist she no longer had any thoughts of self-harm. It's worth noting something important here. Years later, when they were on trial, the Johnsons would gain access to thousands of pages of their daughter's treatment records, sections of which were blacked out to protect her privacy. Nowhere in the records of her 4 months in hospital is there any mention of Emily making a specific allegation of sexual assault against her father or her mother. And despite all of the suspicions that had been raised about the family, Emily's doctors approved her return home only a month after the horrendous bridge incident. To her sister Rebecca, it seemed the worst of the storm had passed.
She was home for 6 weeks. We got her nearly off all her drugs. She went shopping with Dad. Just like, there was not a problem in the world.
Back at training, Emily bumped into old friends like Kathy.
She said that she was, going okay, and she seemed, pretty good. Not her necessarily, super bubbly self, but was, going, I suppose, ahead as normal. If anything, she maybe seemed just a little kind of, tentative around people, maybe just a little kind of hesitant in a way. I would say it was only the people who knew her closely would kind of recognise anything.
Susan Johnson recalls the doctors advising her to tread carefully with her daughter, to reduce her medications gradually, and not question her too much about her time in hospital.
If I raised anything, she just sort of said, it doesn't matter anymore. It's over. But she did say that it was, especially in the adolescent ward, that the nurses there were. Well, she basically said they were fucked. that was her word. Excuse my, but that's what she said. She said they were all on medication, and she could sort of say to them what she wanted, and it was like. They were all different ones were counselling her. There was all different people talking to her. She said it was not useful, and she needed to just move on from it. And that's exactly what she appeared to be doing.
The Johnsons converted the garage into Emily's bedroom to give her more privacy. And Martin Johnson remembers a shopping expedition with his daughter when she tentatively opened up about her time in the mental health ward.
Yeah, it was just coming down one of the hills on the freeway, and that's when she raised the issue about, first time she'd mentioned to me since she'd been home, She goes, Dad, please don't let me go back in that place. I don't want to go back in that place. She went really quiet for a while, and it's probably 3 or 4 minutes, and I didn't want to push her on it.
Emily stopped going to her weekly counselling sessions with Donna, and according to her mother, she wanted to retrieve her diaries from the sexual assault centre. So Susan Johnson drove there one day with Emily and her sister Rebecca, who recalls a strange confrontation in the reception area when Donna suggested that Emily come into the counselling room.
She started fighting with her. I'm not going in. I just want my diaries back, and that's all. And I want to go. That's how she was, very stern. She's a bit like me, like doesn't take bullshit when she doesn't want to. She's like that to her. And she'd said, no, you need to come in with me now. And if you want your diaries, I have to make copies of them, which to me was not normal, like a little bit like it was a big issue. They started fighting, actually yelling.
Emily had turned 18 during her months in the hospital, and she was becoming more rebellious. Her brother Daniel recalls walking into her room to find Emily posing naked as her boyfriend Sam took photos. A short time later, she moved into the converted garage and invited Sam to sleep over, in defiance of her parents' rule that there were to be no boyfriends sleeping over while her brother was still underage. Martin Johnson was furious when he found out and admonished both Emily and Sam. Sam remembers the incident as an example of his controlling nature.
And yeah, he made a big deal of it, and I was like, oh, sorry, I didn't realise I had to ask permission. I mean, I said I've been seeing your daughter for 2 years or something, or 3 years. And I was like, I just sort of presumed that you were all on board for whatever. So yeah, I thought that was really weird.
Sam says he had noticed the tension between Emily and her father for some time. He believed she was afraid of her father, and he recalls that she'd been almost shaking when she had to tell him about the overseas sexual assault. But on this occasion, Emily stood up to him, storming off, and saying she was going to live at Sam's house. Three days later, she turned up at the hospital, distressed and disorientated, confessing that she'd taken an overdose. In the emergency department, she told doctors about the argument with her father and that she'd moved out of home. But she also mentioned something else that had tipped her over the edge. In the days after she moved out of home, Emily had learned about a family secret that had been kept from her. It harked back nearly 3 decades, to a time before she was born, before her parents had married. The secret was this. In the 1980s, when Martin Johnson was a high school sports teacher, he'd been accused of grooming and sexually abusing female students under his care. For Emily, learning about her father's past would have a traumatic and immediate impact.
Shadow of Doubt is a podcast investigation from The Australian. It's written and presented by Richard Guilliatt and produced and mixed by our multimedia editor, Lia Tsamoglou. I'm Editorial Director Claire Harvey, host of our daily news podcast, The Front, where you'll hear our journalists talking candidly about their stories. You can listen to The Front on your smart speaker every morning. Just say, play the news from The Australian to hear the latest episode. Subscribe to our channel Crime X Plus on Apple Podcasts or search The Australian wherever you get your podcasts. And you can check out all our journalism anytime at theaustralian.com.au.
In the next episode of Shadow of Doubt.
And that's when she just looked at me straight in the eyes. When she made the comment to me that I'll make sure no one ever believes you again.
The psychiatrist, particularly with her, to put a sort of a cloak around it and guard it.